There is a face that transcends time and borders. A name that evokes the struggle for freedom, the unity of a nation, and the monumental weight of history. Abraham Lincoln, the 16th President of the United States, the savior of the Union, the great emancipator. But who was this man really? Not the myth etched in marble, but the complex human being, forged in the harshness of the frontier, with his fears, his flaws, his melancholy, and his singular genius. Imagine a boy growing up in a one-room cabin, in the heart of an unforgiving wilderness. No formal schooling for more than a few months of his life. No privileges, no connections. How did this boy, born into abject poverty in 1809, become the central figure in the darkest and most defining moment in American history? How did he, a small-town lawyer with a single disappointing term in Congress, rise to weather the storm of secession and lead a nation torn apart by civil war? His life is a tapestry of contradictions. The joke teller who bore a deep sadness, the shrewd politician who was known for his unflinching honesty, the man who hated war but became commander-in-chief of an army of millions, the leader who sought unity but made the most divisive decision of his era, the emancipation of slaves. On this journey, we'll dive deep. From his first steps in the rough land of Kentucky and Indiana through his unlikely rise in Illinois politics, the electrifying debates that launched him onto the national stage, the 4 harrowing years of the Civil War, and the tragedy that sealed his fate and his legacy. Get ready to discover the story of a man who, against all odds, not only saved a nation, but redefined what it meant. This is the saga of Abraham Lincoln, and it's a story you need to know. Our story begins on February 12, 1809, in a log cabin near Hodgenville, Kentucky. His father, Thomas Lincoln, was a migrant carpenter and farmer, an illiterate man who was resilient but often unlucky in business. His mother, Nancy Hanks Lincoln, was an intelligent and deeply religious woman whose exact ancestry remains somewhat of a mystery, but who instilled in young Abe an early love of reading and Bible stories. He had an older sister, Sarah, and a younger brother, Thomas, who died in infancy. Life on the frontier was brutal. Disease, poverty, unrelenting physical labor. When Abe was just 7, the family moved to southern Indiana, partly because of land disputes in Kentucky. They settled in an even wilder area, where Thomas had to literally build his life from scratch. The family lived in a half-face camp, a makeshift structure with one open side, for nearly a year before building a cabin. Abe's formal education was sporadic and minimal. He attended makeshift ABC schools for short periods, perhaps totaling no more than a year of formal instruction throughout his childhood. But he was insatiably curious. He devoured every book he could find. The Bible, Plutarch's Parallel Lives, Aesop's Fables, Robinson Crusoe, Benjamin Franklin's autobiography. He read and reread, practicing writing on wooden tablets with charcoal, quoting passages to anyone who would listen. At the age of 9, Abe suffered a devastating loss. His mother, Nancy, died of milk sickness, caused by drinking contaminated milk. It was a terrible blow to young Lincoln. Life on the farm became even harder. Thomas Lincoln remarried a year later to Sarah Bush Johnston, a widow with 3 children. Sarah proved to be a warm and affectionate stepmother, encouraging Abe's love of reading and protecting him from the excessive physical labor imposed by Thomas, who viewed reading as laziness. Abe grew up strong and tall, reaching his final height of 6'4" in his teens. He was known for his strength, but he hated the hard, monotonous work of the farm. His mind was always elsewhere, absorbing information, telling stories, arguing. At the age of 21, in 1830, the Lincoln family moved again, this time to central Illinois. Abe helped the family settle in, but felt the need to make his own way. He worked at various jobs, chopping wood, operating a ferry, and finally settling in New Salem, Illinois. In New Salem, Lincoln worked in a general store, where he gained a reputation for honesty. One famous story involves him walking miles to return a few cents to a customer who had overpaid. He also worked as a postmaster, and because of his skill with numbers and penmanship, as a surveyor. He mingled with the community, participated in debate clubs, and began to take a serious interest in politics. It was in New Salem that Lincoln decided he wanted more. He studied on his own, reading borrowed law books, learning grammar and rhetoric. His self-taught education was giving him the tools to rise. The transition from manual laborer to aspiring politician and lawyer was not easy, but Lincoln possessed a quiet ambition and a remarkable ability to learn and persuade. In 1834, at the age of 25, he was elected to the Illinois General Assembly as a representative from Sangamon County. He joined the Whig Party, which at the time was opposed to President Andrew Jackson and advocated policies such as national banking, government-funded internal improvements, and protective tariffs, ideas that resonated with Lincoln's vision of a growing, interconnected nation. In his later years in the state legislature, Lincoln established himself as a loyal and capable Whig politician. He was known for his logical reasoning, his ability to tell insightful anecdotes, and his commitment to the state capitol, successfully advocating for the capital to be moved from Vandalia to Springfield, where he moved in 1837. In Springfield, Lincoln continued to study law and in 1836 was admitted to the Illinois bar. He formed a law partnership and began practicing law, traveling the court circuit, arguing cases ranging from small land disputes to murder cases. His legal practice became the main source of his income and gave him a deep understanding of the lives of ordinary people and the workings of the law. His honesty as a lawyer was legendary. He would turn down cases he considered unfair. Lincoln's personal life also took shape in Springfield. He met Mary Todd, an intelligent, well-educated, and socially prominent woman from a respectable Kentucky family, whose family owned slaves. An irony considering Lincoln's future. After a tumultuous engagement, they were married on November 4th, 1842. Lincoln and Mary's marriage was complex, marked by ups and downs, but they shared a deep affection and mutual respect, and she was a political force behind him. The couple had 4 children: Robert Todd Lincoln, born 1843, Edward Baker Lincoln, Eddie, born 1846, William Wallace Lincoln, Willie, born 1850, and Thomas Lincoln, Tad, born 1853. The untimely deaths of Eddie in 1850 and Willie in 1862 inflicted great pain on the couple, especially Mary, and left deep scars on Lincoln. In 1846, Lincoln sought and won a seat in the U.S. House of Representatives, representing Illinois' 7th District. His time in Washington, 1847 to 1849, was notable primarily for his stance on the Mexican-American War. Lincoln, like many Whigs, was skeptical of the motives for the war, seeing it as an attempt by President James K. Polk to expand territory southward to accommodate slavery. He introduced the Spot Resolutions, challenging Polk's claim that American blood had been spilled on American soil, demanding that Polk show the exact spot where it had occurred. Although his stance on the war was unpopular in his largely pro-war congressional district, the experience in Washington exposed Lincoln to the national political scene and, crucially, deepened his exposure to the issue of slavery. Although he was not a radical abolitionist at the time, he viewed slavery as a moral evil and opposed its expansion into new territories. He even introduced a bill in the House to abolish slavery in the District of Columbia, with compensation to planters and approval by local voters, a bill that failed. After a single term, Lincoln did not seek re-election, partly due to a political compromise within the party and partly due to the local unpopularity of his views on the war. He returned to Springfield and devoted himself more intensely to his law practice, which flourished in the 1850s. It seemed that his national political career was at an end. The American political scene in the 1850s was dominated by one issue: slavery and its fate in the expanding territories. The Compromise of 1850 had postponed the confrontation, but it did not resolve it. The Fugitive Slave Act, part of that compromise, deeply offended the North and increased tensions. The event that brought Lincoln out of his self-imposed political retirement was the passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act in 1854. This act, sponsored by Senator Stephen Douglas of Illinois, his future rival, repealed the Missouri Compromise of 1820, which had prohibited slavery north of the 36° 38 line. Instead, the act allowed the residents of the new territories of Kansas and Nebraska to decide for themselves the issue of slavery through the principle of popular sovereignty. For Lincoln, this act was a moral and political disaster. He believed that slavery was an evil that should be contained, not expanded. The idea that popular sovereignty could legalize slavery where it had been prohibited was deeply disturbing. The backlash against the law in the North was fierce, leading to the collapse of the Whig Party and the emergence of new anti-slavery parties, including the Republican Party. Lincoln immersed himself in politics again, delivering powerful speeches against the Kansas-Nebraska Act and the expansion of slavery. His Peoria address in October 1854 is a landmark, articulating his position that slavery was a moral evil and a political one. Although he did not advocate immediate abolition or racial equality, positions that were radical for the time. He viewed slavery as a domestic institution, where it already existed, but he vigorously opposed its spread. In 1856, Lincoln joined the newly formed Republican Party, which was fundamentally opposed to the expansion of slavery into the territories. He quickly became one of the party's leading spokesmen in Illinois. The culmination of Lincoln's rise to national prominence came in 1858, when he challenged Stephen Douglas, the so-called Little Giant, for his seat in the U.S. Senate. The campaign was marked by a series of 7 public debates in towns throughout Illinois. These debates became legendary and were widely reported in the national press. While Douglas advocated popular sovereignty, arguing that the territories should decide on slavery, Lincoln skillfully cornered him. In the Freeport debate, Lincoln asked Douglas whether the inhabitants of a territory could legally exclude slavery before becoming a state, despite the Supreme Court's ruling in the Dred Scott case that Congress could not prohibit slavery in the territories. Douglas responded with what became known as the Freeport Doctrine, asserting that, although the court had held, slavery could not exist in a territory unless local laws protected it, and residents could effectively exclude it simply by not passing such laws. The Freeport Doctrine helped Douglas win the Illinois Senate election. Senators were elected by state legislatures at the time, and Democrats held the majority. But it alienated Southern Democrats, splitting his party ahead of the 1860 presidential election. More important, the debates catapulted Lincoln onto the national stage. He became known as an eloquent speaker and an articulate opponent of the expansion of slavery. His most famous rhetoric came before the debates, in his House Divided speech in Springfield in June 1858. "A house divided against itself cannot stand. I believe that this government cannot last permanently half slave and half free. I do not expect the Union to be dissolved. I do not expect the House to fall, but I do expect it to cease to be divided." 1. This prophetic statement underscored the impending crisis. Although he lost the Senate election, Lincoln's political stature grew immensely. He continued to give speeches in other states, refining his message. In February 1860, he was invited to speak at Cooper Union in New York City. Before an audience of prominent Republicans, he delivered a masterful speech arguing that the Founding Fathers intended to restrict slavery, and that the Republican Party was the true defender of the original principles of the Republic. The speech was a triumph, solidifying his reputation in the East and making him a serious contender for the Republican presidential nomination. The 1860 presidential election took place in a climate of intense national division. The Democratic Party split regionally over the issue of slavery, fielding 2 candidates, Stephen Douglas, a Northern Democrat, and John C. Breckinridge, a Southern pro-slavery Democrat. A 4th candidate, John Bell, ran on the Constitutional Union ticket, seeking to avoid the issue of slavery. The Republican Party, meeting in Chicago, nominated Abraham Lincoln as its candidate, who was seen as more moderate and electable than better-known figures such as William Seward. The 1860 Republican platform explicitly opposed the expansion of slavery into the territories, but stated that it would not interfere with slavery where it already existed in the southern states. They also supported a national bank, tariffs, and a transcontinental railroad, economic development policies that appealed to the interests of both the North and the West. The campaign was bitter and often threatening. In the South, Lincoln's election was seen as a direct threat to their way of life and to the institution of slavery. Although Lincoln had repeatedly stated that he did not intend to interfere with slavery in the states where it already existed, Southern leaders, fearful and resentful, did not believe him. Lincoln won the 1860 election, albeit with less than 40% of the popular vote. However, because of the division of his opponents and the concentration of the Republican vote in the North, he won a clear majority in the Electoral College, carrying every free state except New Jersey, where he shared the electoral vote with Douglas. The reaction in the South was immediate and drastic. Even before Lincoln's inauguration in March 1861, 7 states in the Deep South, South Carolina, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas, declared their secession from the Union and formed the Confederate States of America. They elected Jefferson Davis as their president. The period between the November 1860 election and the inauguration in March 1861 was one of intense crisis and uncertainty. The incumbent president, James Buchanan, believed that secession was illegal, but also that the federal government had no authority to prevent the states from seceding. He acted ineffectively, and the crisis deepened. Lincoln, still in Springfield, watched the Union disintegrate. He remained largely silent publicly, so as not to further inflame the situation. But he communicated with party leaders and prepared himself for the monumental task that lay ahead. He firmly believed that secession was unconstitutional and that his primary duty was to preserve the Union. Lincoln's journey from Springfield to Washington, D.C. in February 1861 was a period of apprehension. He made stops in several cities, giving speeches that sought to appease the South and reaffirm his commitment to the Union, but also his opposition to secession. Arriving in Washington in disguise because of assassination threats, he found a tense and divided capital. On March 4, 1861, Abraham Lincoln delivered his inaugural address on the steps of the United States Capitol. It was a carefully calibrated message. He sought to reassure the public that he had no intention of interfering with slavery where it existed, and that the Southern states had nothing to fear if they remained in the Union. However, he made it clear that he considered the Union perpetual and that no state could legally secede. He promised that he would hold, occupy, and possess the property and places belonging to the government, but that there would be no invasion or use of force against the people of the South unless they were the aggressors. Lincoln closed with a poignant appeal for unity. "We are not enemies, but friends. Though passion may have strained, it must not sever our bonds of affection. The mystic cords of memory, stretching from every battlefield and patriotic grave throughout this broad land, will still vibrate when touched, as they surely will be, by the better angels of our nature." Lincoln's appeal, however, fell on deaf ears in the seceded South. The crisis reached its boiling point. Abraham Lincoln's presidency was defined entirely by the American Civil War. Less than 6 weeks after his inauguration, on April 12, 1861, Confederate forces bombarded Fort Sumter, a Union fort in Charleston Bay, South Carolina. The attack was an act of aggression against federal property and the spark that lit the fuse of war. Lincoln acted decisively. He called for 75,000 volunteers to crush the rebellion, suspended habeas corpus in strategic areas, a controversial move, but one he believed necessary to suppress dissent in the North, and ordered a naval blockade of southern ports. 4 additional border states, Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas, seceded in response to Lincoln's call for troops, joining the Confederacy. Maryland, Delaware, Missouri, and Kentucky, slave states that remained in the Union, were constant flashpoints. Lincoln assumed the role of commander-in-chief of a nation divided and unprepared for war. The early years were filled with frustration for the Union. Defeat after defeat in the East, ineffective military leadership, political opposition from Copperhead Democrats, who advocated peace at any cost, and the immense logistical task of raising and supplying an army of hundreds of thousands of men. One of Lincoln's greatest challenges was finding generals capable of defeating the Confederate armies led by Robert E. Lee. He went through a succession of commanders of the Army of the Potomac: McDowell, McClellan, multiple times, Pope, Burnside, Hooker, Meade, before finally finding his man in Ulysses S. Grant in the West. The major accomplishments and challenges during the war were: 1. Preserving the Union, primary goal. Above all else, Lincoln's goal was to keep the United States intact. He believed that the survival of American democracy and the very idea of popular government depended on the Union's ability to resist secession. He saw the Civil War not as a war to abolish slavery, initially, but as a war to suppress a rebellion and defend the Constitution. 2. The Emancipation Proclamation, a transformational moment. Lincoln initially resisted turning the war into a crusade to abolish slavery, fearing that he would lose loyal border states and alienate Northern Democrats. However, as the war dragged on, he realized that attacking slavery was both a military necessity, slave labor sustained the South's war economy, and a moral opportunity. Following the costly but strategic Union victory at the Battle of Antietam in September 1862, Lincoln felt he had the military groundwork to issue a preliminary proclamation. On January 1, 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation went into effect. The document declared that all persons held as slaves in the states and parts of states that were in rebellion against the Union are and shall henceforth be free. It is crucial to understand what the proclamation did and did not do. It did not apply to the border states that remained in the Union, nor to the areas of the South already under Union control. It applied only to the territories controlled by the Confederacy, where Lincoln's authority did not exist in practice. It was, at its core, a legal military measure based on Lincoln's powers as commander-in-chief to confiscate property, slaves, used in support of the rebellion. However, the impact of the proclamation was monumental. It changed the purpose of the war. From a fight to preserve the Union, it became also a fight for freedom. It encouraged thousands of slaves to escape to Union lines, and, crucially, it allowed black soldiers to enlist in the Union Army, transforming the workforce and demographics of the Army itself. Some 200,000 black soldiers and sailors served in the Union, playing a vital role in the eventual victory. The Emancipation Proclamation was the first step toward the complete abolition of slavery, which would be accomplished by the 13th Amendment to the Constitution in 1865. 3. The Gettysburg Address, redefining the nation. In November 1863, 4 months after the Union's vital victory at the Battle of Gettysburg, Lincoln was invited to deliver appropriate and brief remarks at the dedication of a military cemetery at the site of the battle. His speech, less than 300 words long, took only about 2 minutes to deliver, but it became one of the most important and eloquent speeches in American history. In the Gettysburg Address, Lincoln not only honored the fallen, but redefined the meaning of the Civil War. He began by evoking the founding principles. 7 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty, and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. 2. He described the war as a test to see whether a nation conceived on those principles could long endure. He declared that the task of the living was to ensure that these soldiers had not died in vain, dedicating themselves to the great task which remains before us, that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. The speech transformed the war from a fight for the Union, as it was to a fight for a better Union based on equality and popular rule. 4. Political management and leadership. Lincoln faced immense political and personal pressure. He managed a cabinet full of rivals, maintained the support of the border states, suppressed dissent in the North, navigated foreign affairs, avoiding European recognition of the Confederacy, and maintained public morale, or tried to. He used his political skills, patience, and remarkable ability to read people to manage the complexities of the wartime presidency. 5. The election of 1864, a referendum on the war. Lincoln's re-election in 1864 was not assured. The war dragged on, casualties were high, and the public was weary. He faced General George McClellan, his former commander of the Army of the Potomac, who ran on a platform of negotiated peace. However, Union military victories in the summer and fall of 1864, such as Sherman's capture of Atlanta and Sheridan's victories in the Shenandoah Valley, improved morale and helped Lincoln secure a decisive electoral victory. His victory demonstrated that the people of the North, despite their suffering, were determined to see the war through and ensure the preservation of the Union. 6. Second Inaugural Address, Vision for Reconciliation. On March 4, 1865, with Union victory looking increasingly certain, Lincoln delivered his second inaugural address. It was a remarkably short and deeply religious speech, focusing on the causes and meaning of the war, and looking toward a future of reconciliation. Lincoln did not seek to place blame on the South, but reflected on the fact that both sides read the same Bible and pray to the same God, and each invokes his help against the other. He saw the war as a divine judgment on the nation because of slavery. He ended with a vision for peace and reconstruction. With malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in justice as God gives us to see justice, let us strive to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who has borne the battle and for his widow, and for his orphan, to do all in our power to bring about and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations. This speech revealed Lincoln's desire for a generous and speedy reconciliation after the war. He was already considering plans for reconstruction, advocating a relatively lenient approach to reintegrating the southern states. By the spring of 1865, the Confederate armies were exhausted and surrounded. On April 9, 1865, General Robert E. Lee surrendered to General Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia. The American Civil War, the bloodiest conflict in the nation's history, was finally coming to an end. The North erupted in celebration. Lincoln, relieved and hopeful, was already thinking about the next steps to reunite the nation. He had visited Richmond, the fallen Confederate capital, shortly after its capture, and was greeted by newly freed slaves who saw him as a liberator. Just 5 days after Lee's surrender, on the evening of April 14, 1865, Lincoln decided to take a break from the unrelenting pressures of the presidency. He and Mary went to see a play, Our American Cousin, at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. In the audience was John Wilkes Booth, a famous stage actor and a fervent Confederate sympathizer who had conspired with others to attack leaders of the Union government. While Lincoln was watching the play, Booth entered the presidential box, waited for the right moment, and shot Lincoln in the back of the head with a Derringer pistol. Booth leaped from the box onto the stage, shouting in Latin, "Sic semper tyrannis," thus always to tyrants, the Virginia motto, before escaping despite breaking his leg in the fall. Lincoln was taken to a guest house across from the theater, where doctors tried to save him. He never regained consciousness. The next morning, April 15, 1865, Abraham Lincoln died. Edwin Stanton, his Secretary of War, famously said, "He is now history." The nation that Lincoln had fought so hard to preserve was plunged into unprecedented mourning. Millions mourned the loss of the man who had guided them through their most difficult war. Lincoln's body was transported by train in a massive funeral procession from Washington, D.C. back to Springfield, Illinois, making stops in numerous cities where crowds of mourners came to pay their respects. Lincoln's death at the hands of a Southern extremist, just days after the end of the war, shocked the nation and had profound implications for Reconstruction. His successor, Andrew Johnson, took a much softer approach than many Northern Republicans desired, leading to years of political conflict and hardship for newly freed African Americans in the South. Lincoln's dream of a quick and harmless reconciliation would prove much more difficult to achieve. Abraham Lincoln died at the height of his leadership, having guided the nation through its most existential crisis. His untimely death sealed his image as a martyr for the Union and for freedom. His legacy is imposing and multifaceted. He is revered as the savior of the Union, the president who demonstrated that democracy could survive even under the most extreme pressure. He is celebrated as the great emancipator, the leader who, though initially reluctant, took the crucial step to end slavery and pave the way for equality, although the struggle for racial equality was far from over. In addition to his political and military achievements, Lincoln is remembered for his character, his honesty, his resilience in the face of personal and military tragedy, his compassion, even for his enemies, his keen intellect, and his remarkable ability to communicate, expressed in speeches that still resonate today. Lincoln was not perfect. He shared some of the racial prejudices of his time, and his actions were sometimes dictated by political and military necessity, not just moral principles. The Emancipation Proclamation, for example, was as much a weapon of war as an edict of freedom. Yet he showed a remarkable ability to grow and evolve in his views, driven by events and the rising morality of the struggle. Lincoln's story reminds us of how fragile the unity of a nation can be, and the terrible price that is sometimes paid to preserve it. He assumed the presidency at its darkest hour, facing challenges that would have crushed most men. Through his leadership, determination, and unwavering belief in America's founding ideals, he succeeded not only in preventing the house divided from falling, but also in laying the foundation for a more just and inclusive union. From the humble hut to the pinnacle of power, Abraham Lincoln's journey is a testament to the potential of democracy and the resilience of the human spirit. He left us a legacy of unity, freedom, and a perpetual challenge to live up to our nation's highest ideals. His life and death continue to inspire and remind us that the fight for a new birth of freedom is an ongoing effort. The giant who was born on the frontier and saved the Union may be gone, but his vision and his words live on. They are a beacon for America and the world, a reminder that even in the deepest darkness, hope, justice, and unity are causes worth fighting for, and if necessary, dying for. If this story has already captivated you so far, just imagine what's yet to come. So don't waste any more time. Subscribe to the channel now, activate the bell so you don't miss the next episodes, and leave a like. This will really help this content reach more people who, like you, are passionate about history. And take the opportunity to comment below. What other character or historical moment would you like to see here? Your suggestion could become the channel's next video, so you can be part of this journey.